The lights were low, the air was thick with smoke, and somewhere in a small Los Angeles club, a voice rose from the shadows. It wasn't the kind of voice that demanded attention, it invited it. Soft, soulful, and full of truth. But somewhere along the way, the world stopped listening. He wrote songs that carried messages of love and hope, words that still echo through time, yet his own name quietly slipped from the spotlight. How does a man who gave the world put a little love in your heart fade into silence? This is the story of Jimmy Holiday, a voice that defined what soul can feel like. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea. Sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before there was a stage, before there were lights, there was a boy in Durant, Mississippi, who listened to the wind carry songs across the fields. His name was Jimmy Holiday. Born on the 24th of July, 1934, he grew up in a world where hard work and hope often had to share the same breath. His family worked the land as sharecroppers, and life in the rural South was a test of endurance, sun up to sundown, one day after another. But even in those long hours, Jimmy found rhythm. Music was the one thing that made sense to him. In the evenings, when others rested, he'd hum melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than words. The radio was his window to the world, gospel on Sunday, jazz on a Friday night. Somewhere between those sounds, his soul began to take shape. When his family moved to Iowa, the contrast was sharp. The land was colder, the towns quieter. But Jimmy carried Mississippi inside him. He tried to fit in, tried to imagine a different kind of life. For a short while, he thought boxing might be his way out: gloves, rings, and the promise of victory. But even then, music kept calling. The rhythm he once threw punches to became the rhythm he wrote to. He started with the alto saxophone, drawn to its voice, smooth but aching. He played wherever he could: small gigs, smoky rooms, local dances. People began to notice that he didn't just play. He felt every note. That sense of feeling, that soul, would follow him for the rest of his life. By the late 1950s, he had found his way to Los Angeles, chasing the same dream that had pulled so many young men and women west: to be heard. Los Angeles was alive back then: neon lights, record stores, hopeful singers waiting in line outside studios. Jimmy was one of them, carrying a saxophone case in one hand and a notebook full of songs in the other. In 1958, he recorded his first single, Voice of the Drums, for 4-Star Records. It was a small label, but to Jimmy, it felt like standing on the edge of something big. The song blended R&B with jazz phrasing ahead of its time, but it didn't catch on. The record barely made a whisper in the market, and for most, it was forgotten as soon as it was pressed. But not for him. For Jimmy, it was proof that his dream was real. Failure didn't stop him. It taught him patience. He played in house bands, backed other singers, and wrote songs no one had asked for. He watched the success of others: Sam Cooke, Ray Charles, Ben E. King, and instead of bitterness, he felt determination. "Maybe my time just hasn't come yet," he'd tell friends. The truth is, Jimmy Holiday never had an easy path. He didn't have powerful connections or money to fall back on. What he had was a voice tender but strong, and a belief that somewhere, someone would need to hear it. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing the chance to share what he carried inside. Late nights in Los Angeles turned into years. He learned the unspoken rules of the business: that talent wasn't always enough, that timing could make or break a career. Still, he kept writing. In a small rented room, with a secondhand guitar and a tape recorder, he started shaping songs about love, loss, and faith, songs that sounded like the life he knew. By the time the early 1960 arrived, Jimmy had grown into his sound. His voice was warm, worn, and unmistakably human. It didn't need polish, it needed truth. When he stepped up to a microphone, there was no showmanship, just soul. People said his singing felt like a conversation, as if he were talking directly to you, one heart to another. He didn't know it yet, but that quiet persistence would soon bring him a song that would change everything. For now, he was still that man from Mississippi, living in a small apartment, waiting for someone to really listen. Before the fame, before the records, there was just Jimmy, a dreamer with a notebook, a melody, and the hope that someday the world might finally hear his song. By the time the early 1960 arrived, Jimmy Holiday had been chasing music for nearly a decade. He was no longer the young man with a saxophone and a dream. He was a working musician, hardened by every missed chance and every late-night set that paid just enough to make rent. Still, there was something unbreakable in him. His break came quietly, almost by accident. In the early 60s, Jimmy signed with Everest Records, a label small enough to listen but brave enough to take risks. It was there he recorded "How Can I Forget," a song that sounded like a confession whispered into a microphone. The track was simple, built around longing and memory, but Jimmy sang it as if the whole world had left the room. When the record was released in 1963, it began to move slowly at first, then steadily climbing the Billboard R&B charts. It reached number 8, and even broke into the pop charts at number 57. For the first time, Jimmy heard his own voice on the radio, somewhere between Sam Cooke and Ben E. King. For a moment, he was part of that golden wave of soul that defined an era. But there was irony hiding beneath the success. The song that gave Jimmy his biggest break also carried him into the background. When Ben E. King recorded "How Can I Forget," his version became the one everyone remembered. Jimmy had written the song, lived it, and felt every word but the world attached it to another voice. That was the cruel truth of the industry. Sometimes the writer stayed invisible. Jimmy never complained. "As long as the song lives," he once said, "so do I." After that small but meaningful success, he tried to keep the momentum. He recorded more singles for Everest, each one steeped in emotion, but none managed to capture the same spark. The company shifted focus, and like many black artists of the time, Jimmy found himself drifting between small, independent labels, Kit, Tip, Diplomacy, each promising something new but delivering little. Yet he never stopped working. Every session, every stage, every lyric mattered. His sound was changing too, moving from the clean, pop-inflected soul of the early 60s into something grittier, more honest. You could hear the weight of experience in his phrasing, the ache of survival in every note. In Los Angeles, he started to build a quiet reputation. Other singers knew his name, not the fans, but the ones who understood what it took to make music that real. He became known as the singer's singer, the kind of artist other performers admired but few audiences truly discovered. By the middle of the decade, Jimmy was still waiting for the right place, the right home for his voice. The industry had moved fast, chasing new sounds and younger faces. But Jimmy didn't chase trends. He believed in songs that told the truth. And in 1966, that truth finally found its way back to him through a new label that would carry his most soulful work and give him one more chance to step into the light. In 1966, Jimmy Holiday found a new beginning with Minute Records, a small Los Angeles label that gave soul singers space to breathe, to feel, to be themselves. It wasn't a major deal with big promises, but Jimmy didn't need that. What he needed was a place where the music came first. His first single for the label, "Baby, I Love You," was the sound of a man reclaiming his identity. It was warm, rhythmic, unpolished in all the right ways. The song reached number 21 on the Billboard R&B chart and broke into the pop chart at 98, not a massive hit, but enough to make the industry take another look at the man they had overlooked. Minute Records saw something special in him. That same year, they released his album, The Turning Point, a fitting title for what would become the defining chapter of his recording career. The album was a collection of songs that felt lived in, drawn from the corners of his life. Heartache, redemption, quiet hope. Each track carried the texture of his soul. The critics didn't call it groundbreaking, but listeners who found it never forgot it. To them, Jimmy's voice wasn't just singing, it was storytelling. He didn't chase trends or mimic the giants of the time. While the charts were ruled by the likes of Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, and Marvin Gaye, Jimmy carved out his own corner of honesty. His follow-up singles, "Everybody Needs Help" in 1967 and "Spread Your Love" in 1968, carried the same sincerity. They reached modest spots on the R&B charts, numbers 36 and 35, yet each song felt like a journal entry, another page in the story of a man who refused to give up. What made Jimmy different was that he didn't treat music as a product. It was communication. He wrote about the human condition, the way people in small towns write letters they never send, full of emotion, truth, and silence. Around this time, his health began to falter, though few knew it. He performed through the pain, smiling for the audience, holding notes longer than he should. And every night, when the applause faded, he'd retreat backstage, exhausted but content. Because for Jimmy, even one person truly listening was enough. Minute Records wasn't a powerhouse, but it gave him freedom, something few artists ever find. In those studio walls, surrounded by musicians who believed in him, Jimmy Holiday found the truest version of himself. But fate, as always, had its own rhythm. Just as the music began to align, his body started to betray him. And in the summer of 1968, one night on stage, the story of Jimmy Holiday would take a turn no one expected one, that would silence the spotlight and leave only the echo of his voice. By 1967, Jimmy Holiday had found his rhythm not just as a performer, but as a storyteller. On stage, under the dim blue lights of Los Angeles clubs, he didn't need grand gestures or fancy suits. His voice carried everything. Smooth yet raw, weary yet warm, it wrapped around every listener like a memory they'd almost forgotten. The world of soul music was alive then. Radios played Sam and Dave, Aretha Franklin, and Otis Redding, a generation's heartbeat pulsing through speakers across America. And somewhere between those frequencies, Jimmy's voice began to rise again. Songs like Everybody Needs Help and Spread Your Love might not have topped the charts, but they traveled far beyond numbers. They reached the kind of people who listened not for fame, but for truth. He became a fixture on the soul circuit, traveling from city to city, performing in halls, theaters, and clubs filled with faces that looked just like his. He'd step on stage, adjust the microphone, and close his eyes. For a few minutes, there was no industry, no competition, just the exchange of feeling between a man and his audience. In 1968, he was at his creative peak. His songs carried that perfect balance between heartbreak and hope, the emotional honesty that defined real soul. Critics who noticed him called him the gentleman of heartbreak. Other artists admired his phrasing, the way he could stretch a note until it became a confession. Behind the scenes, Jimmy's life had grown quieter. Fame had never come easy, and he had learned not to chase it. What he wanted now was peace, the kind that comes from knowing you've given your best to the world. The studio became his sanctuary. At Minute Records, he worked closely with producers and musicians who respected his craft. Together, they built something timeless, one session at a time. During this period, Jimmy also began writing songs for others. One of them, Put a Little Love in Your Heart, would later become one of the most recognized messages of kindness in popular music. It was covered by countless artists, from Jackie DeShannon to Annie Lennox and Al Green, but its spirit belonged to Jimmy. That song captured everything he believed in. That love, even when small, could change the world. In photos from that time, you can see the quiet pride in his eyes, the tired smile of a man who'd fought his way back into the light. He wasn't a superstar, but he was something rarer, an artist at peace with his art. For a moment, it seemed like the world had finally caught up with him. He had purpose, respect, and the music he loved. But like so many stories in soul music, joy came with a shadow. Because soon, the rhythm that carried his life would stumble not from lack of faith, but from something far more fragile. And when it did, the man whose songs spoke of love and resilience would find himself facing the one thing even soul couldn't save him from: silence. In the summer of 1968, Jimmy Holiday walked onto a stage in Los Angeles for what should have been just another night. The lights were warm, the crowd small but loyal. He had done this 1,000 times, walked out, gripped the microphone, closed his eyes, and poured his soul into the air. But that night was different. Midway through his set, something in his chest gave out. His hand slipped from the mic stand, and he fell hard to the floor. The band stopped. The room went silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos broke the stillness as people rushed toward him. Jimmy was taken to the hospital, where doctors discovered the truth he had tried to ignore. His heart was failing. The next weeks blurred into months. Surgeries, rest, recovery, and a kind of quiet that no musician ever wants to know. For the first time in years, he couldn't perform. The stage, the lights, the sound, all of it vanished. His world shrank to hospital rooms and the soft hum of medical machines. The man whose voice once filled clubs now spoke in whispers. But Jimmy Holiday was not a man built to surrender. While his body healed, his mind turned to music. With a pen and notebook by his bed, he began to write again. The songs that came from this period were different, deeper, slower, filled with the ache of someone who had seen too much of both joy and loss. When he returned to the studio in 1969, his voice had changed. It was lower, heavier, carrying the echo of everything he had survived. He recorded "I'm Gonna Use What I Got" a declaration as much as a song. It didn't chart, but it said what he needed to say, that he still had something left to give. His final single for Minute, "A Man Ain't Nothing Without a Woman," came out in 1970. It was tender, bittersweet, and full of wisdom. The critics barely noticed, and the radio stations passed it by. But if you listen closely today, it feels like a goodbye, not bitter, just honest. The industry, as it always does, moved on. The world was shifting, new trends, new sounds, new faces. Jimmy's kind of soul was no longer what labels wanted. He had been a man of melody in a business now chasing volume. By the early 1970s, his name had nearly vanished from the charts, but his spirit hadn't. He still showed up for recording sessions, still wrote songs, still believed that somewhere, somehow, love could find its way through music. There's a photo from around that time, Jimmy sitting alone at a piano, his head bowed, a cigarette in his hand. The studio light catches the side of his face. You can almost hear what he's thinking, that maybe he had given the world everything he had, and maybe that had to be enough. And in that quiet, in that acceptance, the next chapter of his story began, one written not in fame, but in silence. After his heart surgery in 1968, Jimmy Holiday's world slowed to a pace he didn't recognize. The man who once filled rooms with music now spent long afternoons sitting by a window, staring at the light shifting across the wall. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It was a reminder that life had changed, that nothing lasts forever, not even a song. When he finally returned to the studio, the fire was still there, though dimmer. In 1969, he recorded "I'm Gonna Use What I Got," a song that sounded less like ambition and more like survival. It was a promise to himself. His voice carried a new depth, shaped by pain, wisdom, and the quiet understanding that he was living on borrowed time. But the industry didn't wait for him. The late 1960 period was brutal for soul artists who weren't chart toppers. Funk and rock were taking over. Record labels wanted flash, not feeling. Jimmy's style, subtle, reflective, deeply emotional, was out of step with what executives could sell. He poured his heart into one last single for Minute Records, "A Man Ain't Nothing Without a Woman," in 1970. The song told the truth about love and vulnerability, about how a man's worth wasn't measured in fame or money, but in the people who stood by him. It was the kind of song that could have been timeless if anyone had been listening, but no one was. The record went unnoticed, and the label quietly let him go. The phone stopped ringing. The tours dried up. And for the first time since he was a boy in Mississippi, Jimmy found himself without music to return to. He tried again in 1971 with "Save Me" for Dow Records, a song that sounded like a prayer whispered into the dark. It was raw, aching, and beautiful. But radio stations didn't pick it up. The song disappeared, and so did he, retreating further from the city that had once promised everything. People who knew him then said Jimmy never lost his kindness, even when the world turned its back. He'd still write songs on scraps of paper, humming melodies to himself, quietly believing that music, even unheard, still mattered. But there was a loneliness that crept into his days, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just lingers. By the time the mid-70s came, Jimmy had stopped chasing what the world called success. He'd been broken by the business and by his own fragile heart, yet there was still grace in the way he carried himself. He wasn't bitter, just tired. He once told a friend, "I gave my life to the song. Maybe that's all I was meant to do." And maybe he was right, because sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the quietest places, from the people the world forgot to applaud. By the time the 1970 decade came to an end, Jimmy Holiday was living in a kind of silence that only artists understand. The world had moved on new sounds, new names, new definitions of success. The man who once sang of love and healing now watched from a distance as the music industry became louder, faster, and colder. He recorded one final song in the mid-70s for Ray Charles' crossover label, "When I'm Loving You." It had that same gentle honesty that marked all of Jimmy's work: smooth vocals, thoughtful phrasing, a melody that felt like a heartbeat. But the single never reached the airwaves. It slipped quietly into the archives, like a letter never mailed. That disappointment marked the end of his recording career. The man who once filled his days with sessions and stages now spent his evenings in solitude. Friends recall him as calm, reflective, a man who accepted his fate with grace. He never spoke badly about the industry or the people who forgot him. He simply said, "I did what I came here to do." Eventually, Jimmy moved back to Iowa, the place that had once shaped his dreams, long before the lights of Los Angeles ever touched his name. He lived simply, surrounded by family and a few close friends. He still wrote from time to time, jotting down ideas in notebooks that would never be published. The music hadn't left him. It had just turned inward. By then, his health had grown fragile again. The strain of years on the road, the heart surgery, the quiet struggles, they had taken their toll. But even as his body weakened, his spirit stayed gentle. Those who saw him in his final years said his smile was still the same, soft, tired, but kind. On the 15th of February 1987, Jimmy Holiday's heart finally gave out. There was no headline, no tribute special, no chart resurgence. Just a quiet passing in the same kind of peace he had always given others through his music. For days, the news barely spread. Only a few newspapers mentioned his name. But somewhere, on old turntables and dusty jukeboxes, his songs still played, "Baby, I Love You," "Spread Your Love," "How Can I Forget." The people who had loved him once, the ones who had danced or cried to his music, still remembered. They didn't need a reminder. Jimmy never got his star on Hollywood Boulevard. He never became the face of soul music. But what he gave, the truth, the tenderness, the sincerity, became something far more lasting. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not on the charts, not on the radio, but in the way certain songs make you feel quietly, deeply, without asking for attention. That's where Jimmy Holiday still lives. Long after Jimmy Holiday was gone, his music refused to disappear. It lingered in the quiet corners of America, in diners that still played 45 records, in old cars where soul never stopped spinning, in the hearts of those who remembered the way his voice felt like truth. He was never a superstar, but his influence reached deeper than fame ever could. Among musicians, Jimmy was known as a craftsman, a songwriter who didn't chase hits, but built songs that could outlive him. The proof of that came through one of the most enduring tunes in popular music, "Put a Little Love in Your Heart." He co-wrote the song in 1969, and it became a cultural anthem recorded first by Jackie DeShannon and later covered by artists like Al Green and Annie Lennox. It wasn't just a pop hit, it was a message, a plea for kindness in a time when the world seemed to forget how to care. Every time that song plays in a movie, in a commercial, or at a family gathering, a small piece of Jimmy Holiday sings again. That's the quiet beauty of his legacy. His voice didn't vanish, it simply changed form. His spirit traveled through the melodies he left behind. Collectors and soul historians began to rediscover his catalog in the 1980 period. Reissues of The Turning Point and Baby I Love You appeared on budget CDs, often tucked away in the classic soul section of record shops. And each time someone stumbled upon his name, they found more than nostalgia, they found honesty. Jimmy's records carried a warmth that modern production couldn't fake. For new generations, his songs became a time capsule of a more human kind of music, the kind that wasn't about perfection but about presence. You could hear the imperfections, the breaths between verses, the ache behind the smile. That was Jimmy Holiday's fingerprint. Music critics, looking back, began to understand what he had done. He had given voice to the everyday man, the working-class dreamer, the lover who didn't always win, the soul that never stopped trying. In that sense, Jimmy wasn't just a musician. He was a reflection of the America he came from. He showed that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet persistence of someone who keeps creating even when no one is listening. His legacy reminds us that the truest measure of success isn't applause, it's the echo that remains long after the crowd is gone. Today, when you hear "Put a Little Love in Your Heart," or the first chords of "How Can I Forget," it feels like he's still here whispering the same message he always believed in. That love, in any form, is worth sharing. And maybe that's why Jimmy Holiday still matters. Because even after all the lights went out, He left us something to hold on to, a little love, and a voice that will never quite fade away. In the years after his passing, America began to remember Jimmy Holiday in quiet ways. Not through awards or headlines, but through rediscovery, a song here, a radio feature there, a new generation finding his voice buried in old vinyl collections. Collectors started to trade his records again, passing them between hands like fragile artifacts. In small music forums and soul clubs across the country, his name resurfaced, whispered with reverence, the way you speak of someone who deserved more than they ever received. In Europe and Japan, where classic American soul has long found devoted audiences, Jimmy's work found a second life. DJs and collectors unearthed the turning point and played his songs in underground clubs in London, Paris, and Tokyo. To those listeners, he wasn't forgotten at all. He was a secret one worth protecting. Music historians began to call him the missing bridge between traditional soul and the introspective singer, songwriters of the 1970 period. His phrasing, his restraint, his lyrical sincerity, all of it, anticipated the emotional honesty that artists like Bill Withers and Donny Hathaway would later perfect. But in America, the recognition was slower. Mainstream audiences often measure greatness by charts and awards, and Jimmy had neither. Yet among true soul lovers, the ones who still spin vinyl and understand what heartache sounds like, his legacy is undeniable. Writers from magazines like Wax Poetics and Soul Tracks began publishing features about his career, describing him as a man who made music for people who listen with their hearts. Radio hosts dedicated late-night segments to his songs, introducing him to audiences who had never heard his name before. Each reintroduction carried the same tone: disbelief that such a voice could ever be forgotten. What made Jimmy Holiday's story resonate decades later wasn't just his music, but his humanity. He never became bitter. He never stopped believing in love, even when the world seemed indifferent to it. And that quiet grace, that unbroken spirit, became part of what people admire most about him now. Today, in online discussions about the pioneers of soul, his name sits beside those who defined the genre: Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, Donny Hathaway. He might not have reached their fame, but he shared their truth. His songs remind listeners that soul music was never about spectacle, it was about sincerity. And beyond the borders of genre or fame, Jimmy Holiday's story has come to represent something larger: the American artist who gave his all, not for glory, but for meaning. The songwriter who poured his heart into the world, even when the world wasn't paying attention. It's fitting that his most famous creation was a song about love, because love was the thread that tied everything together: the beginning, the struggle, the legacy. He may have been forgotten by Hollywood, but not by the people. Not by the ones who still hear his voice in the quiet moments and feel, even for a second, that small reminder he left behind to put a little love in your heart. The stage is dark now, the crowd is gone, and the echoes of applause have long faded. But somewhere, in the stillness of that silence, Jimmy Holiday's voice still lingers, soft, steady, and unbroken. His story was never about fame. It was about endurance, about what it means to keep creating even when no one is watching. He came from the fields of Mississippi, found his way to Los Angeles, and gave the world music that carried more heart than glamour. And though his time under the lights was brief, the warmth of his voice still reaches those who listen closely enough. What makes his legacy so powerful isn't the number of records he sold or the awards he won. It's the truth behind every note, the reminder that greatness isn't loud, and love doesn't need a stage. Jimmy Holiday's songs didn't just speak about life. They were life full of struggle, tenderness, and quiet hope. When you listen to How Can I Forget or Put a Little Love in Your Heart, you're not just hearing a singer from another time. You're hearing a man who believed that kindness could be its own form of resistance. A man who kept giving when the world had nothing left to give back. There's something deeply American in that, the idea that even when forgotten, you can still matter. That legacy isn't measured by fame, but by how your work touches people you'll never meet. Jimmy's songs may have been written decades ago, but their message is timeless. Love still heals, and music still remembers. So tonight, as you finish this story, take a moment to listen, maybe to an old record, or just to the quiet around you. Somewhere in that stillness, his voice is waiting. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Jimmy Holiday the respect he deserved? Or does his real legacy live in the hearts of those who still remember? If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button and help keep Jimmy Holiday's light alive. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, because every message, every memory, helps us keep these forgotten voices singing. Some stars burn bright and fade fast. Others, like Jimmy Holiday, shine quietly, not in the sky, but in the soul, and that's where they belong.